An expectant single mother thought she was alone on the farm when the true owner appeared. What began as a misunderstanding turned into a forbidden love that changed their lives forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment where you are watching from. The sweet aroma of corn muffins being prepared for breakfast still lingered in the air when Sarah jolted awake at the distant roar of an engine on the dirt road. Her brown eyes opened immediately, her heart racing as it had for the past few months since she arrived at her family's abandoned farm in Oak Valley. At 7 months pregnant, her prominent belly made every movement more challenging, but the adrenaline of fear propelled her out of the narrow bed with surprising agility. The wooden house where she had taken refuge creaked softly with the September morning breeze. The weathered boards told stories of decades of abandonment, with small cracks between them allowing golden rays of sunlight to filter into the simple space. Sarah walked to the foggy window, wiping the glass with the sleeve of her faded cotton shirt. Her brown hair, tied in a messy ponytail, swayed as she stretched her neck to see the road better. The sound of the engine was getting closer. It was definitely a pickup truck, judging by the deep, constant noise echoing among the trees. Sarah felt the baby move in her belly, as if also restless about the unexpected arrival. She placed her hand over her belly, whispering softly, "Calm down, my love. Mommy will take care of us." 3 months ago, Sarah had sought refuge in this isolated place after being kicked out of her conservative parents' home in Springfield. The revelation of her pregnancy had caused a scandal in the traditional family. She could still hear her mother's icy voice echoing in her mind. "How could you embarrass us like this, Sarah? A single pregnant daughter. What will they say at church?" The maternal family's farm had been abandoned for years after her grandfather's death. Sarah vaguely remembered visiting it in her childhood, running among the orange groves and playing near the stream that cut through the property. Now the place was wild, with vegetation growing freely and the old structures covered in vines and moss. The noise of the pickup truck suddenly stopped. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had chosen this refuge, believing she would have months of solitude to decide her future, to find the strength to raise her child alone. Determined and fiercely loyal by nature, she carried the emotional weight of being rejected by her own family at the moment she needed support the most. "Who could it be?" she murmured, nervously biting her lower lip. The rusty iron gate creaked. Firm footsteps approached the main house, located about 50 meters from the small cottage where Sarah had settled. She watched through the wild foliage surrounding her makeshift window. Tall man stepped down from the navy blue pickup truck, clearly used for farm work. His leather boots thudded against the dry earth as he walked with determined strides toward the main house. Sarah could see he wore faded jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned, muscular arms. Even from a distance it was evident that his hands were calloused, typical of someone who had worked the land since childhood. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and he carried a clipboard in his left hand. His movements were confident, like someone who knew the place well. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "He must be lost," she tried to convince herself. "He'll leave soon." But the man did not seem lost. On the contrary, he examined the main house with a knowledgeable gaze, jotting down notes on the clipboard. Then he began to walk around the property, inspecting the old farm structures, the abandoned chicken coop, the artesian well, the ivy-covered machine shed. Sarah realized she was holding her breath. The baby kicked, as if protesting against her tension. She sighed, trying to calm both herself and the child. "What do I do now?" she murmured, running her hand over her belly. "If he is the new owner, I will have to leave here. And where will I go with you, my little one?" The fear of not being able to be a good mother alone constantly tormented her. During sleepless nights, when the silence of the countryside enveloped her, Sarah struggled between the desire to accept help and the need to maintain her hard-won independence. She had learned to trust only herself after being disappointed by the child's father and rejected by her family. The man continued his meticulous inspection of the property. He stopped near the old chicken coop, making more notes. Sarah noticed that he had the same determination in his brown eyes that she recognized in herself. There was something in his posture that conveyed seriousness and purpose. Suddenly, he stopped and looked directly in the direction of the cottage where Sarah was hiding. For a terrifying moment, she was sure she had been discovered. Their hearts, hers and the baby's, seemed to beat in accelerated sync. But the man merely observed the smaller building for a few seconds before jotting something down on the clipboard and continuing his walk. Sarah leaned against the wooden wall, closing her eyes and trying to control her breathing. The tears she had been holding back for months threatened to overflow. The loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty about the future all seemed to crumble at that moment. "I can't keep hiding forever," she whispered to herself. "I need to face this." The sound of the man's footsteps approached again. Sarah headed to the front door, took a deep breath, and opened it slowly. It was time to find out who this stranger was and what he wanted with the farm that had become her only refuge in the world. The morning sun, Sarah opened the door of the cottage, her pregnant silhouette framed against the golden light filtering through the trees, creating a dramatic contrast. The man stopped immediately upon seeing her, the clipboard nearly slipping from his hands. For a few seconds that felt eternal. They exchanged glances in complete silence, each processing the surprise of the unexpected encounter. "Good morning," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She instinctively placed a hand on her belly, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the stranger. "Good morning," he replied, removing his cap to reveal slightly wavy brown hair. His voice was deep, with a gentle rural accent that hinted at his country roots. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am. I didn't know anyone was living here." Sarah stepped down the 2 wooden steps leading to the small porch of the cottage, walking slowly due to the weight of her belly. The simple blue cotton dress she wore was a bit too loose, a remnant from the days when she still lived with her parents and had clothes suitable for her former life. I can explain," she began, swallowing the lump in her throat. "My name is Sarah. This farm belonged to my maternal grandfather, Frank Oliver. I didn't know it had been sold." The man furrowed his brow, consulting some papers he pulled from the back pocket of his jeans. Sarah noticed his fingers were long and skilled, marked by calluses that told the story of years of hard work. "Frank Oliver," he murmured, scanning the documents. "Yes, here it is. He was a partner of my grandfather, Anthony Smith, decades ago. My name is David. David Smith. I inherited this property 2 months ago." Sarah felt her legs wobble. The baby chose that moment to give a particularly strong kick, making her grimace in discomfort. David immediately noticed and stepped forward, concern etched on his sun-kissed face. "Are you okay? Do you want to sit?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied quickly, but accepted when he offered his arm to support her as they walked to a fallen log that served as an improvised bench. "It's just the baby reminding me that he's here." David sat at a respectful distance, his leather boots gently touching the characteristic red soil of the region. He studied Sarah, with attentive eyes, but without judgment, something she hadn't been accustomed to receiving lately. "When is the baby due?" he asked, his voice laden with genuine kindness that surprised Sarah. "In 2 months," she replied, lovingly running her hand over her belly. "At the end of November, according to the doctor." "And you are here, alone?" The simple question carried so much emotional weight that Sarah felt her eyes welling up with tears. She nodded, not trusting her own voice to respond without breaking. David remained silent for a few moments, observing the landscape around them. The abandoned fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with native trees and a few mango trees still bearing wild fruit. The creek murmured softly in the distance, its constant music being the only company Sarah had had in recent months. "Look," David finally said, turning to face her. "I came here today to make the initial assessments of the property. I plan to turn this place into a modern organic farm, but—" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "You can't be pregnant living alone in this isolated place. What if something happens?" Sarah raised her chin in a proud gesture that David recognized immediately. It was the same fierce determination he saw in the mirror every day. "I managed to get here on my own, didn't I?" she said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't need charity from anyone." "I'm not offering charity," David replied, his tone remaining calm but firm. "I'm being practical. You know this place. I need someone who understands the history of the property, and you need a safe place to have your baby." Sarah studied him carefully. There was something about his demeanor that inspired confidence. Broad shoulders that seemed capable of carrying any burden, hands that showed honesty through hard work, eyes that met hers directly without flinching or showing discomfort with her situation. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. "Stay in the cottage until the baby is born. From what I can see, you've done a good job keeping the place clean and livable. In exchange, if you know anything about accounting or management, you could help me with the paperwork for the business I'm setting up." Sarah was taken aback. "You would trust me to handle your accounting? You don't even know me." David gave a small but genuine smile. "My grandfather always said that the best measure of a person's character is how they take care of things when no one is watching. This place has been abandoned for years, but the cottage you're living in is immaculate. That tells me everything I need to know." The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah involuntarily smiled. "He's active today. I think he senses when I'm nervous." "I don't know the sex yet," Sarah confessed, "but I have a feeling. I want it to be a surprise." David nodded in approval. "My mother always said that the best gifts in life are the ones wrapped in mystery." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a mockingbird land on a nearby tree branch. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace, as if maybe, just maybe, things could turn out all right. "So," David said, standing up and extending his hand to help her, "do we have a deal?" Sarah looked at the outstretched hand, then at the honest face of the man before her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she wasn't completely alone in the world. "We have a deal," she said, accepting his help to stand. And in that moment, under the warm September sun, a partnership began that would change both of their lives forever. 2 weeks after the first, a delicate routine began to establish itself on the farm. Sarah woke up every morning to the sound of David's hammer echoing through the valley, a steady and comforting rhythm that replaced the absolute silence of the previous months. The noise had become her favorite morning music, a symphony of renewal announcing that she was no longer alone in the world. The October morning was especially cool when Sarah stepped out of the cottage carrying a mug of coffee and a folder with papers. Her steps were slower now, at 8 months pregnant, but she had gained a newfound confidence in the last few weeks. The navy blue maternity dress she had managed to buy in the nearby town with her savings made her feel more presentable. "Good morning, David," she shouted, waving towards the main house, where she could see him fixing the porch that had sagged in a few spots. "Good morning, Sarah," he replied, pausing his work and walking in. Her direction. "How did you sleep? Did the baby let you rest?" Sarah smiled, gently touching her belly. That little rascal decided to throw a party at 3 in the morning. I think he's going to be a very active boy." David laughed, wiping his hands on the cloth he always carried in his pocket. During these 2 weeks, Sarah had observed his habits. He was meticulous with tools, always organizing everything after use. He drank at least 5 cups of coffee a day, and he had a habit of whistling softly when he was focused on a task. "You brought last week's numbers," Sarah said, handing him the folder. "The construction material expenses were within the budget you gave me, but you need to decide on the organic seed suppliers. I received 3 different quotes." David flipped through the papers, his brown eyes scanning the numbers organized in Sarah's neat handwriting. She had used her skills as a former office worker to create a simple yet efficient financial control system for the organic farm project. "You're impressive with numbers," he said, amazed. "In 2 weeks, you've organized my financial life better than I managed in 2 months. Sarah blushed. "Slightly. I've always liked math. I worked at my uncle's accounting office in Springfield before—" She hesitated. "Before everything happened." David noticed the change in her tone and didn't press for more details. He had learned that Sarah had deep wounds related to family and the father of the child, topics she was not yet ready to discuss. "Let's look at these seed proposals while I have my coffee," he suggested. "Would you like some?" "Yes, please." They walked to the main house's porch, where David had improvised a work table with 2 planks on sawhorses. Sarah carefully sat in, the wooden chair he had brought especially for her, while David went to get the coffee. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of the damp earth from the morning drizzle. Sarah took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of genuine contentment. The baby stirred gently, as if also approving of the peaceful environment. "Here you go," David said, returning with 2 enamel mugs. "I still don't have fine china here." "It's perfect," Sarah replied, warming her hands on the mug. "Better than any fancy porcelain." They leaned over the seed budgets. David explained the differences between the organic varieties, his voice animated as he spoke about sustainable agriculture. Sarah watched him talk, noticing how his eyes sparkled when he described his plans to transform the abandoned fields into a modern, eco-friendly farming operation. "Have you always wanted to be a farmer?" Sarah asked during a pause in his explanation about crop rotation. David scratched his stubbled chin, a gesture Sarah was learning to recognize as a sign that he was deep in thought. "Actually, I worked as an agronomist in a large cooperative in Oak Valley," he said. "I was well paid, had an apartment, in the city, a settled life. But when my grandfather died and left me this place, I realized I was tired of helping others achieve their rural dreams. And you decided to pursue your own." "Exactly. I've always wanted to prove that it's possible to do large-scale organic farming profitably. This farm has perfect soil and access to water from the creek. It just needs work and planning." Sarah nodded, impressed by the passion in his voice. "And did your family support your decision?" David's face closed off a bit. "My parents think I've lost my mind. They left the family farm 30 years ago to live in São Paulo and never understood why I love the land. They wanted me to sell this place and invest the money in the city." "But you didn't consider it?" "Not for a second," David said firmly. "This place has history. It has life. It's not just land, it's legacy." Sarah felt a deep connection to those words. She too was seeking to create a legacy for her child, something solid and real amidst so much uncertainty. "Can I ask you a question?" David said, hesitating. Sarah nodded, though she felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "The father of the child. Does he know where you are?" Sarah looked down, nervously fiddling with the handle of her mug. "He doesn't care where I am," she finally said, her voice low but firm. I found out he was married only after I got pregnant. When I told him about the baby, he offered me money to resolve the situation. When I said I was going to have the baby, he said he didn't want to see me again." David clenched his fists, anger flaring in his eyes. What kind of man does something like that? "A man who doesn't deserve to know this baby," Sarah replied, her hand protectively over her belly again. "My child and I will be just fine on our own." "Not alone," David said softly. "Not while I'm here." The moment was interrupted by the sound of tires on the dirt road. They both looked towards the gate, where a silver BMW was parking. An elegant woman stepped out of the car, her high heels clearly unsuitable for the rural terrain. "Who is she?" Sarah asked. David sighed heavily. "Trouble is coming." The woman approaching the house walked, with the confidence of someone used to commanding boardrooms in New York. Her perfectly styled blonde hair contrasted sharply with the rural surroundings, and her impeccably tailored grey suit seemed completely out of place among the trees and red soil. Sarah watched as the visitor's high heels sank slightly into the ground with each step, forcing her to walk with extra caution. "Jessica," David said, rising from the makeshift table, his voice laden with attention Sarah had never heard before. "Dave!" The woman smiled widely, but Sarah noticed that the smile did not reach her calculating blue eyes. "You look rustic." Jessica stopped in front of the porch, her eyes quickly scanning the environment before landing on Sarah. For a fraction of a second, her expression revealed surprise and something that seemed like disapproval, but she quickly regained her professional mask. "I didn't know you had company," Jessica said, her tone slightly frosty. David stepped down from the porch steps. "Jessica, this is Sarah. She's living in the cottage and helping me with the farm's accounting. Sarah, this is Jessica Roberts, an attorney specializing in real estate law." "Nice to meet you," Sarah said politely, but remained seated. The baby had started kicking more intensely, as if sensing the tension in the air. "The pleasure is mine," Jessica replied, but her eyes had already turned back to David. "Dave, I need to talk to you about urgent matters regarding the estate. They are delicate issues." Sarah began to rise. "I can go to the cottage and leave you to—" "No," David said quickly. "You can stay. If these are matters about the property, you should know as well, since you're living here." Jessica visibly hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's presence. "David, these are complex legal issues. It might be better if we discuss them privately." "Jessica," David crossed his arms over his chest. "What's going on?" The attorney dramatically sighed and opened her leather briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. "I discovered serious irregularities in the estate documentation. The property registry office in Oak Valley found discrepancies in your grandfather's papers." Sarah felt a chill in her stomach. David paled slightly. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Undeclared debts, old mortgages that were not properly settled, and—" Jessica paused dramatically. "Possible partners not mentioned in the will." "Partners?" Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice revealing genuine concern. Jessica looked at her coldly. "Yes, apparently your grandfather Anthony had old partnerships that were never formally dissolved. This could significantly complicate the legal situation of the property." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had already recognized as a sign of stress. "What does that mean in practice?" "It means," Jessica said, stepping closer to him and placing a possessive hand on his arm that did not go unnoticed by Sarah, "that you could lose the property if we don't resolve this quickly, and resolving it will be expensive, very expensive." Sarah observed the interaction between the two, noting the familiarity in the way Jessica touched David, as if she had rights that went beyond a professional relationship. The baby kicked harder, and she placed a hand on her belly, trying to calm herself. "How expensive?" David asked, his voice tense. "By my initial calculations, between $20,000 and $30,000 in legal fees, back taxes and possible settlements," Jessica replied, watching his reaction closely. Sarah gasped. It was an astronomical amount for someone starting an agricultural business from scratch. She saw David's dream shattering before her eyes. "And there's more," Jessica continued, now with an almost gentle tone that sounded false. "As long as these issues remain unresolved, you technically cannot make permanent improvements to the property. Any renovations you make could be legally questioned." David slumped into one of the chairs, the reality of the situation hitting him like a hammer. "So all the work I've done so far could have been in vain," Jessica finished, but quickly added, "But I can help, Dave. I have contacts in New York, attorneys specializing in complex rural issues. I can devise a strategy to save the property." "And how much would your help cost?" Sarah asked, her voice colder than she intended. Jessica looked at her with an expression that barely concealed her disdain. "My fees are proportional to the complexity of the case. For a friend like David, I would offer a special discount." "Friend?" Sarah repeated, noticing how the word sounded strange coming from Jessica's mouth. "Jessica and I have known each other for years," David explained, looking uncomfortable. "She worked on some projects for the cooperative where I was employed." "We have a history," Jessica said, smiling at David in a way that made Sarah's blood boil. "I always knew David was special, smart, dedicated, with vision for the future. When I learned he had inherited this property, I wanted to help." Sarah slowly stood up, her feminine intuition picking up on all the nuances of the conversation. "I'll prepare more coffee," she said, heading inside the house. In the rustic kitchen, Sarah leaned against the iron sink and took a deep breath. Through the window, she could see Jessica moving even closer to David, her body language clearly seductive. The attorney laughed at something he said, touching his arm again. "She wants more than to help him legally," Sarah murmured to herself, her hand on her belly. The baby had calmed down, as if also paying attention to the situation outside. When Sarah returned with the coffee, she found Jessica sitting very close to David, her fingers intertwined with his over the table. "So, darling," Jessica was saying, "what do you think about us going to New York this weekend? We can resolve these legal matters and catch up on other things too." David gently withdrew his hand, noticing Sarah's gaze. "Jessica, I appreciate your offer of help, but I need time to process all of this." "Of course," said Jessica, but Sarah noticed the momentary irritation that flashed in her eyes. "But we don't have much time, David. Legal matters like this can get complicated quickly if we don't act soon." Sarah served the coffee in silence, but her mind was racing. There was something in Jessica's story that didn't quite add up, and she was determined to find out what it was. The month of December brought with it the intense rains typical of summer in New York, and it was during one of those violent storms that Sarah felt the first contractions. It was 3 a.m. when she woke up with a sharp pain slicing through her abdomen like a knife. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees with primal force, while the rain hammered against the roof of the cottage with deafening intensity. "Not now," Sarah whispered, struggling to sit up in bed. There were still 2 weeks until the due date. She ran her hand over her tense belly, trying to convince herself it was just a false alarm. But 15 minutes later, a new contraction doubled her over in pain. Sarah looked out the window and saw only total darkness. The storm had knocked out the power in the area hours ago. The only sound besides the rain was the branches of the trees scraping against the wooden walls of the cottage. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed the flashlight she kept by the bed and tried to get up. Her legs wobbled as another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones. Panic began to set in as she realized the reality. She was alone, in the middle of a storm, with no working phone, and the baby was coming. "David," she managed to groan, although she knew he couldn't hear her from the main house with all that noise. Sarah managed to reach the door and opened it. The rain rushed in immediately, soaking the wooden floor. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. The dirt road leading to the property had turned into an impassable mud pit. Even if she could reach the town phone, no ambulance would be able to get through. Another contraction forced her to lean against the doorframe. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to remember the techniques she had read in books about childbirth. "Calm down, Sarah, you can do this," she told herself, even though fear was paralyzing her. It was then that she saw a light cutting through the rain. David was running toward her, a powerful flashlight in one hand and a yellow raincoat partially shielding him from the storm. His steps sank into the mud with each movement, but he kept pushing forward with determination. "Sarah!" he shouted when he got close enough to be heard. "I saw your light on and thought—" He stopped when he saw the expression of pain on her face. "The baby?" "It's coming," Sarah managed to say between two contractions. "The pain started half an hour ago." David didn't hesitate. Within seconds, he had her in his arms, shielding her from the rain with the raincoat as he quickly walked toward the main house. "Let's go. I have a generator and more space." "But I can't. You barely know me." "This isn't your responsibility," Sarah weakly protested. "Stop being silly," David said firmly, climbing the steps of the main house's porch. "Do you think I would leave you and the baby alone at a time like this?" Inside the house, David quickly turned on the generator he had installed the week before. The lights came on, revealing the main room he had renovated over the past few months. He led Sarah to the sofa and rushed to grab clean towels and warm water. "David, have you done this before?" Sarah asked, trying to control her breathing between contractions that were now coming every 5 minutes. "I've helped some cows give birth," he said with a nervous smile, "but I imagine it's a bit different." Despite the pain, Sarah laughed. "A bit different, yes." Over the next few hours, David became the most dedicated birthing partner Sarah could have asked for. He held her hand during the most intense contractions, whispered words of encouragement when she felt she couldn't go on, and kept calm even when fear showed in his brown eyes. "You're being amazing," he said during a moment of pause between contractions, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a damp towel. "I'm terrified," Sarah confessed, her strength waning. "Me too," David admitted, "but you're the bravest woman I've ever met. If anyone can do this, it's you." The storm continued to roar outside when Sarah felt the irresistible urge to push. David, following instructions he had quickly read in a first aid book, positioned himself to help as best he could. "I can see the head," he shouted, emotion overflowing in his voice. "Sarah, it's almost here." With a scream that mixed pain and relief, Sarah made the final push. And then, at 5:37 in the morning, during one of the most intense storms the region had seen in years, a perfect baby came into the world in David Smith's hands. The baby's first cry echoed through the wooden house like a symphony of hope, blending with the sound of the rain that was beginning to lessen outside. David looked at the baby in his hands, tears streaming down his tanned face. "It's a boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Sarah, it's a beautiful boy." Sarah extended her trembling arms to receive her son. When the baby was placed on her chest, she felt a wave of love so intense that she thought her heart might burst. The boy stopped crying immediately, as if recognizing the warmth of his mother. "Michael," Sarah whispered, stroking his small, perfect face. "Your name is Michael." David sat on the floor next to the sofa, still processing what had just happened. He had helped as they brought a new life into the world. The experience had changed something fundamental within him. "Thank you," Sarah said, looking at David with tear-bright eyes. "I will never forget what you did for us." "It was nothing," David replied, but they both knew that wasn't true. It was everything. It was the moment when two lives intertwined irreversibly. Outside, the storm was finally calming down, and the first golden rays of dawn began to filter through the clouds. A new day was dawning, along with a new life, and nothing would ever be the same at the forgotten farm. The months following Michael's birth brought a new and unexpectedly harmonious routine to the farm. David had insisted that Sarah and the baby stay in the main house until she fully recovered, and what started as a temporary medical care measure transformed into a natural and affectionate coexistence. During the early mornings when Michael cried, David often got up before Sarah, warming the bottle and rocking the baby with a tenderness that melted the mother's heart. May brought with it the time for smaller harvests, and also the season of the traditional harvest festival of St. Benedict in Oak Valley, the nearest town to the property. Sarah had hesitated when David suggested they go together, but he argued that Michael needed to be introduced to the local doctor for routine checkups, and enjoying the festivities would be a way for her to meet the community. "Are you sure you want to come with me?" Sarah asked on the morning of the event, nervously adjusting the floral dress she had bought especially for the occasion. Michael slept peacefully in her arms, wearing a tiny country outfit that David had found in a store in Oak Valley. "Of course I do," David replied, adjusting his new plaid shirt. "You two are part of my life now. I want everyone to know that." The natural way he said, "my life," made Sarah's heart race, but she tried not to dwell on his words. In recent months, David had become not just a friend, but a constant and comforting presence. He helped with Michael without her needing to ask, brought wildflowers to brighten the house, and had a habit of humming old country songs while working in the fields. The festival was in full swing when they arrived at the town square. Stalls of typical food released tempting aromas of corn muffins, sweet corn pudding, and hot spice cider, while colourful flags fluttered gently in the evening breeze. A band played country music on the makeshift stage, and couples danced in a square dance area marked with crepe paper. David greeted several acquaintances, introducing Sarah as "my partner in the organic farm" and Michael as the future agronomist of the family. The initial reactions were warm, the women were enchanted by the baby, and the men chatted animatedly with David about his agricultural innovations. But Sarah began to notice the sideways glances, the whispers that stopped when she approached, the forced smiles that didn't reach the eyes of some people. Two ladies from the local church were watching her with expressions that mixed curiosity and barely concealed disapproval. "Mrs. Sarah," one of them said, approaching with a false smile. "What a beautiful baby. And the father, didn't he come today?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. I'm a single mother," she managed to reply, her voice slightly trembling. "Oh," the woman responded, exchanging a significant look with her companion. "What a complicated situation. And you're living on David's farm?" "Sarah is my partner." David suddenly appeared beside her, his voice carrying a warning tone that Sarah had never heard before. "She handles all the administrative side of the business." "Partner?" the second lady repeated, her tone heavy with implications. "How modern." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Michael chose that moment to start crying, as if sensing his mother's tension. She gently rocked him, whispering soothing words, but couldn't stop tears of anger and shame from forming in her eyes. "Excuse me," David said coldly to the two women. "We're going to get something for the baby to drink." He guided Sarah away from the ladies, but the damage was done. Throughout the rest of the night, Sarah noticed conversations dwindling when she passed by, that some groups subtly closed ranks to exclude her, and that curious eyes followed her and Michael's every move. "They're all talking about us," Sarah whispered to David as they watched the square dance from a distant table. "Let them talk," David replied, but Sarah could see the tension in his clenched jaw. Small towns always have people who have nothing better to do than judge others' lives. A group of older men approached their table, clearly intoxicated by the whiskey flowing freely at the festival. The leader of the group, a local farmer named Tony, pulled up a chair and sat down, uninvited. "So, David," Tony said, his voice slurred from alcohol, "I heard you found yourself an interesting companion." "Watch your words, Tony," David warned, his voice low but filled with threat. "Relax, man," Tony laughed, but there was malice in his small eyes. "I just find it funny that a qualified agronomist is getting involved with a woman, how can I put it, used." David's fist clenched on the table, but before he could respond, Sarah abruptly stood up, Michael still in her arms. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "Sarah, no," David protested, standing up as well. "We're not going to let these ignorant people—" "Please," Sarah interrupted, touching his arm gently. "Michael is tired and so am I." On the way back to the farm, they drove in silence. Michael slept in the back seat, oblivious to the emotional storm his adoptive parents were facing. Sarah looked out the window, watching the town lights fade into the distance. "I'm so sorry," David finally said when they arrived at the farm. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why did they treat you that way?" David asked, carefully taking Michael out of the car. "You didn't deserve that." Sarah stopped on the porch of the house, looking at the man who had become so important in her life. "David, you need to understand one thing. People will always judge a single mother living with a man. It doesn't matter what the truth of our situation is." "And what is the truth of our situation?" he asked softly, his intense brown eyes illuminated by the moonlight. Sarah fell silent. For a moment, Michael peacefully sleeping in her arms. The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities and fears. "The truth is, I don't know," she replied honestly. "I just know that you two are the best things that have happened to me in a long time." David smiled gently, touching Michael's little cheek with infinite tenderness. "Same for me." But both knew that the town's rumors were just the beginning of even greater challenges ahead. July brought with it the harsh winter and a devastating discovery that threatened to destroy all of David's plans. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard angry shouts coming from the makeshift office he had set up in the old pantry of the house. Michael, now 8 months old, was playing in his playpen with colorful wooden blocks that David had handcrafted. "This can't be right!" David shouted, and Sarah heard the sound of papers being violently thrown across the table. Worried, Sarah dried her hands on her apron and went to investigate. She found David with his head in his hands, surrounded by documents scattered on the floor. His plaid shirt was wrinkled, and his disheveled hair indicated that he had run his hands through it repeatedly, a gesture that Sarah now recognized as a sign of extreme despair. "David? What happened?" she asked, gently touching his shoulder. "The debts," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "Jessica was right about the irregularities, but the situation is worse than she predicted." Sarah knelt beside him, picking up some of the documents from the floor. They were official notices, property registry stamps, and numbers that made her stomach churn. Her experience in accounting allowed her to quickly grasp the gravity of the situation. $200,000, she whispered, looking at one of the notices. "David, how did your grandfather accumulate such a high debt?" Apparently, he used the property as collateral for several loans over the years, David explained, finally lifting his head. His eyes were red from exhaustion and frustration. And there's more. There are back taxes dating back 10 years. Sarah continued examining the papers, her mind racing to process all the information. And the deadlines? 60 days to pay it all off, or the property goes to auction. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Sarah could hear Michael babbling happily in the kitchen, completely unaware that his future had just become uncertain once again. 2 tears rolled down David's face, and Sarah felt her own heart shatter. "Is there any way to get that money?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. David laughed bitterly. $200,000? Sarah, I invested all my savings in renovating the house and in the farming equipment. I don't even have 10% of that amount. Sarah fell silent, thinking furiously. Suddenly, an idea began to form in her mind, a painful idea, but perhaps the only solution. "David," she said slowly, "what if I talk to my family?" "Your family?" He looked at her with a confused expression. "But you said they kicked you out." "They did," Sarah confirmed, the old pain manifesting in her voice. "But my grandmother left me some jewelry when she died. Antique jewelry of considerable value. It's kept in my parents' safe." David shook his head vigorously. "Sarah, no. I can't let you humiliate yourself for my sake." "It's not for your sake," Sarah said firmly. "It's for our sake. For Michael, for me, for this life we've built together." "But they treated you terribly when you needed them. The most. Why would they do that now?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields that David had begun to cultivate with so much love and dedication. The first sprouts of organic vegetables were starting to emerge, small green signs of hope amidst the dark soil. "Because maybe," she said slowly, "maybe they realized they were wrong. Maybe they miss their daughter and want to meet their grandson. And what if they don't want to help you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Then at least I tried. David, you saved my life and Michael's when we needed it the most. Now it's my turn to save you." That afternoon, after much insistence from Sarah, David drove to a public square in Springfield where there were payphones. Sarah had called ahead to make sure her parents would be home. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number she knew by heart but hadn't used in almost a year. "Mom," Sarah said when the familiar voice answered on the other end of the line. "Sarah?" Linda Smith's cry was a mix of shock, relief, and emotion. "My daughter, where are you? We've been looking for you. For months." "You're looking for me?" Sarah hadn't expected that. "Of course we are, daughter. We made a terrible mistake. Your father and I haven't slept well since you left. Did the baby arrive?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "He did, Mom. A boy. Michael." "Michael," Linda repeated, her voice breaking with emotion. Can I meet him?" "Mom, I need your help," Sarah said, swallowing her pride. "I'm in a complicated situation, and I need Grandma Rosa's jewelry." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The jewelry? Sarah, what's going on?" For the next 20 minutes, Sarah explained her situation, carefully omitting details about her relationship with David, but being honest about the financial difficulties they faced in maintaining the farm. "Come home," Linda said when Sarah finished. "Bring Michael and come home. We will solve this together." "Mum, I can't just abandon—" "You're not abandoning anything, daughter. You're asking for help from your family when you need it. That's what families do." When Sarah returned to the pickup truck where David was waiting anxiously, she couldn't stop crying. "So?" he asked, concerned. "They want to help us," Sarah managed to say between sobs. "And they want to meet Michael." "That's wonderful, Sarah." "Yes," she agreed, but a part of her was terrified. Going home meant confronting a painful past and exposing David to the judgment of her conservative parents. It meant risking the fragile happiness they had built together for a chance to save the farm. But as they drove back home, with Michael sleeping in the back seat, Sarah knew there was no choice. Love sometimes requires sacrifices, and she was willing to sacrifice her pride to protect the family she had chosen. The August morning dawned with a thick fog covering the fields of the farm when a black Mercedes-Benz stopped at the gate of the property. Sarah was breastfeeding Michael on the porch when she saw two men in suits get out of the car, their clothes clearly clashing with the rural environment. David, who had left early to check on the organic tomato crop, had not yet returned. "Good morning, ma'am," said the older of the two, a grey-haired man with gold-rimmed glasses who exuded corporate authority. "We are looking for Mr. David Smith. We are from AgriCorp." Sarah adjusted Michael in her arms, discreetly covering herself with a blanket. "He's in the fields. May I ask what this is about?" "We have a very interesting business proposal for the property," replied the younger man, opening a leather portfolio. "An offer that could solve all his financial problems." Sarah's heart raced. In recent weeks, since discovering the debts, she and David had spent sleepless nights calculating possibilities, desperately seeking solutions. The visit to Sarah's parents had been scheduled for the weekend, but they both knew that even her grandmother's jewelry might not cover the entire debt. "I'll call him," said Sarah, carefully getting up. David appeared 15 minutes later, his boots dirty from red soil and his shirt stained with sweat from the morning's work. Sarah remained on the porch with Michael, but she could hear the conversation unfolding near the makeshift table under the mango tree. "Mr. Smith," began the older man, "my name is Eduardo Santos, Expansion Director at AgriCorp. We are interested in acquiring your property." "The farm is not for sale," David replied immediately, but Sarah noticed a hesitation in his voice that she hadn't noticed before. "We understand perfectly," Santos said with a calculated smile, "but we believe our offer may make you reconsider. We are prepared to offer $1,200,000 for the property." Sarah almost let Michael slip from her arms. It was an astronomical amount, almost 6 times the value of the debt that tormented them. She saw David take a step back, shock written on his tanned face. $1,200,000, he repeated, his voice hoarse with surprise. "Paid in cash," the younger man confirmed. "Our company is expanding operations in the region, and this property has the ideal strategic location for our plans." David ran his hand through his hair, the nervous gesture that Sarah knew all too well. "What kind of operation?" "Large-scale mechanized agriculture," Santos explained. "Soybeans, corn, sugarcane. A modern, efficient operation. We can turn these fields into one of the most productive farms in the region." Sarah watched David's face tighten slightly. Mechanized agriculture was everything he fought against: industrial monoculture that depleted the soil, intensive use of pesticides, destruction of natural biodiversity. It was the exact opposite of his dreams of sustainable organic farming. "And the buyers?" David asked. "Who is behind AgriCorp?" "National and international investors," Santos replied evasively. "People who believe in the future of Brazilian agribusiness." David remained silent for long minutes, looking at the fields where he had planted his hopes. Sarah could see the internal conflict waging in his expression, the desperate need for money against the destruction of his dreams. "I need time to think," David finally said. "Naturally," Santos smiled, "but I must inform you that we are interested in other properties in the region as well. Our offer has a limited time frame, until the end of the week." After the men left, David sat under the mango tree for almost an hour, completely still. Sarah descended from the porch and approached slowly, Michael now peacefully sleeping in. Her arms. "It's a lot of money," she said softly, sitting beside him. "It is," David agreed, but his voice was empty. "Enough money to pay off all the debts, leave a considerable amount, and still be able to buy another smaller property elsewhere. But it wouldn't be the same," David sighed deeply. "Sarah, my grandfather planted the first tree on this property when I was 5 years old. He taught me to feel the texture of the soil between my fingers, to recognize when the land needs rest. This place has history." Sarah gently touched his arm. "And you have dreams. Dreams that may just be that, dreams. Maybe I'm being stubborn, trying to achieve something impossible while you two suffer the consequences of my stubbornness." "David," Sarah turned to face him completely, "you saved my life and Michael's. You gave us a home when we had nowhere to go. If you decide to sell, we will support your decision. But don't make that decision thinking of us as a burden." "You are not a burden," he said quickly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. That's exactly why I'm considering the offer." That night, they had a relatively silent dinner. Only the sound of cutlery against plates and the occasional babbling from Michael broke the silence. The offer from Agricorp loomed over them like a heavy cloud, laden with possibilities and losses. "What if," Sarah finally said, "what if there was a third option?" David looked up from his plate. "What kind of third option?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But maybe we haven't explored all the possibilities. Perhaps there's a way to save the estate and keep your dreams intact." David smiled sadly. "Sarah, I admire your optimism, but sometimes the reality is we have until Friday to decide," Sarah interrupted him, "and until then, we will fight for every possibility." She didn't know yet, but there were forces working behind the scenes that would make this struggle much more complex than she imagined. And the truth about who was really behind the million-dollar offer would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. The discovery came completely unexpectedly on a rainy September afternoon. Sarah was organizing old papers in the attic of the main house, searching for any documents that could help with the legal issues of the estate when Michael began to cry downstairs. She quickly went down to attend to him, leaving a box of dusty documents open on the kitchen table. David returned from the field earlier than usual, soaked from the persistent drizzle that had started in the afternoon. Upon entering the kitchen, his eyes were immediately drawn to a yellowed envelope that had fallen from the box and was partially open on the wooden floor. "Sarah," he called, picking up the envelope and immediately recognizing the letterhead of an accounting office in New York. "Where did this come from?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, Michael in her arms, still trying to calm him. "I found it in the attic. It's old papers from your grandfather. Why?" David examined the document with growing attention, his expression gradually shifting from curiosity to total shock. His hands began to tremble slightly as he read the names listed on the official papers. "Sarah," he said, his voice strangely hoarse, "you need to see this." She approached, adjusting Michael, who had finally stopped crying. "What is it?" "It's a partnership dissolution document," David explained, pointing to the names printed in the header. "Dated 15 years ago. My grandfather, Anthony Smith, and Edward Johnson." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Edward Johnson? The man from Agricorp?" "The same," David confirmed, his voice heavy with rising anger. "They were partners, Sarah. Partners in several farms in the region." Michael chose that moment to start babbling, reaching his tiny hands toward the colorful papers. Sarah kissed his forehead, trying to process the implications of what David had discovered. "But it means Johnson knows every inch of this estate," David continued, pulling more documents from the box. "He knows the real value of the land, is aware of the water springs, the soil quality, and he probably knows exactly how desperate I am to settle the debts." Sarah sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, Michael now playing with the buttons on her shirt. "David, there's more here." She had found a thinner folder at the bottom of the box, containing personal correspondence between the two men. The letters revealed a partnership that had ended in a nasty fight, with mutual accusations of mismanagement and questionable business decisions. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading one of the letters aloud. "Anthony, your insistence on outdated agricultural practices is harming our profits. Modern agriculture demands efficiency, not sentimentality for the land." David clenched his fists. "My grandfather was a visionary. He talked about sustainable agriculture decades before it became trendy. And here," Sarah continued reading, "if you do not accept the modernization of operations, I will be forced to dissolve our partnership and seek more profitable investments elsewhere. Johnson doesn't want to buy our estate to expand the business." David realized, the truth hitting like a punch. He wants to destroy it. He wants to erase any evidence that sustainable methods can be more efficient than industrial farming. At that moment, the kitchen phone rang. David answered, still processing the revelations from the documents. "David!" The voice on the other end was Jessica's, and she sounded frantic. "I need to talk to you urgently." "Jessica, now is not a good time." "David, I found out who is financing AgriCorp," she interrupted, "and you won't believe it." Sarah watched David's face pale as he listened to what Jessica had to say. Michael began to make happy little noises, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around him. "Are you sure?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Absolutely sure." After hanging up the phone, David let himself fall into a chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. "David, what is it? What did she find out?" "The main investor behind AgriCorp," he said slowly, "is Charles Edwards." Sarah frowned. "That name sounds familiar." "It shouldn't," David said, looking directly into her eyes. "He is Michael's father." Sarah's world seemed to stop. Michael, sensing his mother's sudden tension, began to whimper softly. Sarah held him tightly against her chest, trying to process the devastating information. How did Jessica find this out? She was investigating the company's legal documents and found the investment records. Charles Edwards, businessman from New York, married, 3 legitimate children, is the main shareholder of AgriCorp. Sarah felt nauseous. "Does he know I'm here?" "He must know," David replied bitterly. "He probably has known for months. The $1 million offer isn't to help us, Sarah. It's to control us." The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place in a sinister way. Charles had disappeared from Sarah's life after discovering the pregnancy, but he had never really vanished. He had been orchestrating events behind the scenes, using his influence and resources to keep her away from his legitimate family. "He wants me to accept the money and disappear," Sarah realized, her voice barely a whisper. "He wants that I take Michael and leave New York far enough away to never be a problem for him." David stood up and walked to the window, observing the fields he had cultivated with so much love. "And if I refuse the offer, he probably has other plans to ensure we lose the property anyway." Michael began to cry genuinely now, as if he could feel his parents' despair. Sarah gently rocked him, softly humming a lullaby that her own grandmother used to sing. "What are we going to do?" she asked. David turned around, and Sarah saw a steely determination in his brown eyes that hadn't been there moments before. "We're going to fight," he said. "Charles Edwards may have money and influence, but he underestimated one thing." "What?" "He underestimated how much I love you and Michael, and people who fight for love always find a way to win." The December dawn was quiet when Sarah woke to the sound of gentle rain tapping against the windows of the house. Beside her, David slept peacefully, one of his hands still intertwined with hers, a habit they had developed during the tumultuous weeks. In the crib next to the bed, Michael breathed steadily, his tiny fists clenched as if he were determined to face any challenge, even in his dreams. 3 months had passed since the discovery about Charles, and what followed was a legal and emotional battle that tested all the limits of Sarah and David. But on that December morning, Christmas Eve, Sarah finally felt she could breathe in peace. The turning point had begun when Sarah's parents arrived at the farm in October, bringing not only Grandma, Rosa's jewelry, but also a heartfelt apology and a fierce determination to protect their daughter and grandson. Linda and John Smith had spent months reflecting on their mistakes, and the threat posed by Charles had awakened in them a protective instinct that surprised everyone. "No one is going to intimidate our family," John declared on the day they discovered Charles's financial maneuvers. "If that man wants war, he will have war." A deeper investigation into Charles's activities, conducted by a private investigator hired by Sarah's father, revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior. He was facing serious marital problems and investigations for tax evasion, and he saw the farm not only as a way to control Sarah, but also as an investment to hide resources from a possible divorce. The definitive proof came when they discovered that Jessica had been collaborating with Charles from the beginning, providing information about the property's legal situation in exchange for a lucrative partnership in a law firm in New York. The betrayal by the attorney had been a painful blow for David, but it also removed the last obstacle for them to fight united. The local community, which had initially treated Sarah with prejudice, gradually changed its attitude as the true story became known. The priest from St. Benedict's Church in Oak Valley was the first to publicly stand in support of Sarah, followed by several local farmers who admired David's determination to maintain sustainable farming methods. The final confrontation had taken place in a meeting at the Property Registry Office in Oak Valley, where all stakeholders gathered to definitively resolve the property issue. Charles had personally attended, accompanied by a team of expensive lawyers, clearly expecting to intimidate the country folk with his imposing presence. But he had completely underestimated the family that Sarah and David had built around them. Sarah's parents were present, as well as neighbors who had become friends, and even some customers who already bought organic products directly from the farm. The priest had offered moral support, and even Tony, the farmer who had insulted Sarah at the harvest festival, was there to attest to David's integrity. "Mr. Edwards," David said during the meeting, his voice calm but filled with determination, "your offer is rejected. This property is not for sale." "You don't understand, kid," Charles replied arrogantly. "Without my money, you're going to lose everything anyway." "Actually," John Smith interrupted, placing a folder on the table, "you're wrong. My mother-in-law's jewelry has been appraised at a value sufficient to pay off all the property debts. Furthermore, my wife and I have decided to invest in the operation as silent partners." Charles's face visibly paled. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "We do," Sarah said, standing up with Michael in her arms. "We're dealing with a man who abandons his children and tries to destroy families to protect his own interests. But Michael will never need to know him. He already has a father." All eyes turned to David, who approached Sarah and gently touched Michael's face. "If Sarah agrees," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I would like to officially adopt Michael and give him my last name." The tears that streamed down Sarah's face at that moment were of pure happiness. "I accept," she whispered. "We accept." Charles left the meeting in silence, his legal threats proving empty in the face of the solid documentation and community support that Sarah and David had built. Weeks later, they learned that he was facing serious problems with the IRS and that his company had been investigated for dubious business practices. Now, on the morning of Christmas Eve, Sarah quietly got up and walked to the kitchen window. The farm was thriving, literally. The fields of organic vegetables stretched green and vibrant under the morning sun, and the new seedling greenhouse they had built, with part of the money from Grandma Rosa's jewelry, promised an even more abundant harvest for the coming year. "Good morning, future wife," said David's hoarse voice from behind her. Sarah turned around, smiling. "Good morning, future husband." David wrapped her in his arms, both watching through the window as the first light of dawn illuminated their land. The wedding was set for the following spring, in a simple ceremony among the cherry tomato plants, with Michael in Sarah's arms and the entire community present to witness the union of two people who had found true love amidst hardships. "Do you know what makes me happiest?" Sarah murmured, resting her head on David's chest. "What?" "Michael will never know a world where he wasn't completely loved. By me, by you, by the grandparents, by this community. He will grow up knowing that family is not just blood, it's choice, dedication, and love." David gently kissed the top of her head, "and he will learn that the land also needs love to bear good fruit." From the bedroom, Michael began to babble his morning sounds, calling for the parents he had chosen and who had chosen him back. Sarah and David walked together to fetch him, their footsteps echoing harmoniously on the wooden floor of the house they had transformed into a home. The aroma of fresh coffee that David was brewing mingled with the scent of the wet earth coming through the open windows. Outside, the valley was awakening to another day of infinite possibilities, and the family born from love and grown through adversity was ready to embrace every moment of happiness that the future held for them. Love had triumphed, as it always does when it is true, patient, and brave enough to fight for itself.